They sat at the kitchen table, laughing so hard my father spilled his coffee. When I showed them the engraved Crystal Award, the highest honor in my industry, my mother didn't even look up from her tablet. She just sighed and said, "We're not wasting a weekend traveling for some stupid little trophy, Maya. Your brother actually has a real estate license to renew." That was the moment the remaining pieces of my heart shattered. For 28 years, I had chased their approval, bleeding myself dry to prove I was worthy of being their daughter. But to them, I was just the disappointment who chose unstable media production over a traditional corporate ladder. They refused to attend my award ceremony, leaving me to sit at an empty table while everyone else celebrated with family. They called my lifelong dream a joke. But exactly 3 weeks later, they tuned in to the national evening news. And there I was, sitting next to the most powerful anchor in the country, exposing the very truth that would bring my parents' precious world crashing down around them. My name is Maya, and at 28 years old, I finally learned that you cannot force people to love you if they are blinded by their own pride. Growing up in my family meant living as an invisible ghost in the brilliant, blinding shadow of my older brother, Julian. To my parents, Julian was a god. He was the golden boy who stayed local, went into traditional real estate, and wore tailored suits that broadcast the illusion of wealth and stability. I, on the other hand, was the perpetual disappointment. Ever since I picked up my first camera, I was fascinated by the truth. I chose the gritty, unstable path of an independent investigative documentary filmmaker. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly didn't pay the bills early on, but I cared about exposing corruption and giving a voice to the voiceless. To my parents, however, my life's passion was nothing more than a broke hobby. Every family dinner was a masterclass in passive-aggressive dismissal. My mother would smile warmly while listening to Julian talk about his latest property listing, only to turn to me with a heavy, performative sigh, asking when I was going to get a real corporate job with dental benefits. I thought everything would change the night I brought home the news. I had just been awarded the prestigious Vanguard Prize for Investigative Journalism, the absolute highest honor in my industry. It was the validation I had bled for over the last 5 years. But when I showed them the engraved Crystal Award, my father didn't even look up from his coffee. He just spilled a bit on the table, laughed, and muttered, "We're not wasting a weekend traveling for some stupid little trophy, Maya." The night of the gala arrived, and while the venue was a breathtaking sea of glittering chandeliers, crisp tuxedos, and elegant gowns, my heart felt heavy. I sat at a beautifully decorated table right near the front stage, staring at the 2 empty velvet chairs directly beside me. The small, white placeholder cards still read my parents' names. While other winners laughed, toasted champagne, and took photos with proud families, I sat entirely alone, nursing a glass of sparkling water. I kept telling myself that the crystal trophy waiting for me on the stage was all the family validation I needed, but the hollow ache in my chest said otherwise. Just as the master of ceremonies took the microphone to introduce my category, a waiter slipped a folded note into my hand. It read, "Step outside to the terrace. I have the missing pieces to the story you've been chasing." Intrigued, I slipped away into the cool evening air. Waiting in the shadows was a man I recognized instantly, a high-level compliance officer from one of the city's largest property development groups. He looked terrified. Without speaking a word, he pressed a heavy, encrypted flash drive into my palm. He looked me dead in the eye and whispered that this drive held internal ledgers, forged bank audits, and proof of a multi-million-dollar tax evasion and real estate fraud syndicate operating right out of our hometown. He knew my work, and he knew I was the only one brave enough to air it. Back in the quiet glow of my editing studio, the city lights blurred outside my window as I plugged the encrypted flash drive into my master workstation. My hands hovered over the keyboard, heart hammering against my ribs as I unlocked the hidden files. Folder after folder opened up, revealing an intricate labyrinth of shell companies, fake asset valuations, and illicit money laundering schemes designed to siphon millions from unsuspecting investors and commercial properties. It was a textbook corporate syndicate, perfectly organized to evade federal taxes and bleed local accounts dry. I began cross-referencing the transaction logs with public property deeds, tracking the flow of capital through various dummy corporations. But as I traced the primary funding source back to its root, my breath caught in my throat. The room spun slightly. There, stamped on the primary acquisition agreements and holding LLC certificates, was a familiar corporate seal. It belonged to Prime Horizon Real Estate, my brother Julian's firm. As I dug deeper into the financial transfers, an even more sickening truth emerged. Attached to the accounts were personal collateral guarantees signed not just by Julian, but backed heavily by my parents' primary residential properties and their entire retirement portfolio. They hadn't merely invested in a small local business. They had completely mortgaged their futures to become the primary financial backers for a massive, illegal fraud scheme. My parents, who had spent my entire life sneering at my honest journalism and calling my career a joke, were neck-deep in a criminal enterprise. Driven by a final, desperate shred of family loyalty, I didn't take the evidence straight to the police. Instead, I drove to my parents' house the very next evening, carrying a single manila folder containing copies of the transaction logs. When I walked into the dining room, they were all there, my parents, Julian, and his fiancée, celebrating yet another successful property closing. I didn't waste any time. I laid the documents flat on the table, right next to their expensive wine glasses, and explained exactly what the flash drive contained. I begged them to hire a criminal defense attorney and cooperate with federal regulators before the story broke. Instead of gratitude, the room erupted into pure venom. My father slammed his fist onto the table, his face twisted in rage. He accused me of fabricating the entire story out of bitter, petty jealousy because I couldn't handle seeing Julian succeed. Julian sneered, leaning back in his chair with casual arrogance, threatening to use his high-priced legal team to sue me into absolute oblivion if I ever dared to whisper his company's name to the press. My mother just shook her head with disgust, calling me a parasite who was trying to tear down her family because my own life was a failure. That was the moment the last illusion shattered. I looked at the three people who were supposed to protect me, and I realized they were already gone. They chose their pride and their stolen wealth. That night, I walked out into the dark, leaving my loyalty behind. I completely bypassed the independent circuit. I knew that a standard documentary release would take months, giving Julian and my parents too much time to cover their tracks, destroy evidence, or hide their assets in offshore accounts. Instead, I took the fully packaged, airtight investigative package straight to the executive producers at the National Evening News Network on J Street. When their elite legal team reviewed the bulletproof journalism, the internal ledgers, and the recorded transactions, they didn't just buy the story. They offered me the lead slot on a live primetime national broadcast. The studio was cold, the harsh studio lights humming softly as the countdown began. My heart beat steady, fueled no longer by the desire for family approval, but by a deep, unshakable commitment to the truth. The red light on camera one flashed to life, and the country's most respected news anchor turned to the audience, introducing a major breaking exposé on corporate corruption. Then the camera cut to me. Sitting at the main anchor desk, I systematically laid out the entire multi-million-dollar fraud network before millions of viewers nationwide. With absolute precision, I pointed to the graphics on the screen, detailing the exact mechanisms of the shell companies. And right there, on national television, Julian's full legal name, his smug corporate headshot, and the logo of Prime Horizon Real Estate flashed across the screen for the entire country to see. The immediate fallout hit like a sudden, violent tidal wave before the live broadcast had even gone to commercial. Sitting in the studio green room, my phone transformed into a buzzing weapon, lighting up with dozens of frantic, screaming calls and breathless text messages from my parents and Julian. The synthetic sympathy and smug superiority they had practiced for years vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. My mother's messages pivoted wildly from calling me an ungrateful monster to begging me to tell the network it was all a terrible technical mistake. But the truth was already out, and it couldn't be unsaid. Within 48 hours, the wheels of justice turned with terrifying speed. Federal investigators, armed with the precise blueprint my broadcast had provided, froze every single asset tied to Prime Horizon Real Estate and its associated shell companies. Julian was arrested at his upscale office, handcuffed in front of his staff, and charged with grand larceny, tax evasion, and money laundering. Because my parents had blindly signed their names as primary financial guarantors, their entire world collapsed instantly. Their retirement portfolio was completely seized, and their house was placed under a federal lien. The arrogant family who had called my life's work a stupid little hobby was entirely ruined by the very journalism they despised. My father left a final, broken voicemail, his voice shaking with tears as he begged me to use my new national media influence to help get Julian out of jail. I listened to it once, felt a quiet sadness for the family that could have been, and then deleted it forever. 3 months later, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly established independent production studio in downtown, overlooking the glittering skyline. On the mantel sat the engraved Crystal Vanguard trophy, no longer a symbol of the validation I lacked, but a monument to the truth that set me free. Julian pleaded guilty to reduced fraud charges and is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a federal facility. My parents, completely bankrupt, were forced to downsize to a modest apartment, living with the bitter reality of the child they cast aside for a golden illusion. They never call, and I no longer wait for the phone to ring. I survived their cruelty and built a legacy on my own terms. What would you do if your own family tried to destroy your dreams? Comment below, and thank you for watching.